All right. Good morning, everyone. We know that some folks are going to continue to filter in to our session as we get started today, but we want to make sure that we are sensitive to time, and we want to make sure that we give as much time as possible to our conversation. So with that, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on Bridging Divides with our esteemed guest speakers, Christy Vines, John Wood Jr., and Helen Young. My name is Colby Reed. I am the Communications Director for the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, and I have just a couple of quick housekeeping items to cover before we turn things over to our panelists. All attendees in today's webinar have been placed on mute. If you have a question, please feel free to add those to the Q&A box, and we will walk through those at the end of today's session, as many as we can get to. We do have closed captioning available for today's session. If you would like to access that, simply click the closed caption button on your toolbar. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our website in the coming days, and we will email you all a link to that recording once it is posted. We also want to make sure you're aware of a conversation we're hosting next week that we would love for you to join, Lifting the Fog on Climate Change. This is going to be a great conversation with Leslie Hook of the Financial Times and Rachel McMonigal of Landesa on Tuesday, the 23rd at 10 a.m. Pacific time. If you'd like to join that session, you can register on our website, murdochtrust.org. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion to get us started. Helen Young is the opinion editor and editorial writer for The Oregonian, Oregon Live, where she leads the 4-member editorial board in developing its positions on matters of public interest. Prior to moving to the opinion section in 2014, she spent 22 years as a reporter at news organizations, including the Anchorage Daily News, Seattle Times, and the Associated Press. In her career, she has covered Alaska's commercial fishing industry, Oregon's athletic apparel businesses, the Seattle tech scene, and spent 2 months embedded with the Oregon Army National Guard in Iraq. She has a bachelor's degree in literature from the University of Pennsylvania and lives in Northeast Portland with her husband and her daughter, and we are thrilled to have her here today. I'll hand things over to Helen to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Colby. And thank you to the Murdoch Trust for hosting this discussion. The question of how do we bridge divides could not be any timelier. We're lucky today to have 2 distinguished leaders with deep experience in this field joining us. They are Christy Vines and John Wood Jr. Christy is a self-described empathy expert and the president and CEO of Idios Institute. She's best known for her high-energy keynotes, unique perspective on faith, society, and culture, and her ability to help people bridge differences and connect more authentically. In 2015, Christy left the field of national security and global conflict to focus on the advancement of the burgeoning field of empathic intelligence and its role in leadership, cohesion, social cohesion, and the development of sustainable solutions to often intractable issues. She's also the executive producer of the 2022 documentary film Dialogue Lab America, a moving take on the current state of division and polarization in America. Christy is a writer, speaker, and regular contributor on panels and podcasts, such as How Do We Fix It and Bob Goff's Dream Big podcast. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and Capital Commentary. She's currently working on her first book on empathy, faith, and the fight for the future in America. John Wood Jr. is a leading figure in the American depolarization movement. He's National Ambassador for Braver Angels, the country's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to political depolarization. A nationally recognized public speaker on the subjects of political and racial reconciliation, Wood has spoken across America to a wide range of the nation's most respected think tanks, universities, corporations, philanthropic organizations, and political associations. His written work has appeared in a wide range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Examiner, Quillette Magazine, Aereo Magazine, Reflections, a journal of the Yale School of Divinity, Real Clear Politics, Persuasion Magazine, The American Interest, and many others. John is a co-host of the Braver Angels podcast and host of the John Wood Jr. Show. Prior to his work with Braver Angels, John was the state of California's youngest active nominee for Congress in the 2014 election cycle, challenging Maxine Waters in California's 43rd district. His unifying campaign was covered by outlets including the National Review and the Larry Elder Show. After the election, he was elected as second vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles, the largest Republican county party in America. In addition to his work with Braver Angels, John serves as an advisor to the American Project, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and the 1776 Unites Project. He is also a member of the Progress Network and a field builder with the New Pluralists. John has worked in support of educational opportunities for at-risk youth in inner-city Los Angeles in the areas of tutoring and private education. He sits on the board of directors for Strive Arts and Academics, a celebrated private educational facility in South Los Angeles. Thank you to both of you for being here today. I'm wondering if, Christy, how about if you start us off? Can you tell us a little about your background and what experiences motivated you to pursue work in bridging divides and polarization?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Thank you also, as you mentioned, to the Murdoch Trust. This is such an important conversation. I'll start with just talking about, this. I never once thought when I kind of did a mid-career change and started to focus more on kind of the national security foreign policy space that my work would ever kind of turn and be applied to kind of my own fellow citizens, right here in America. But a lot of what I was learning in the field is so applicable now because it's just people disagreeing over, as I mentioned, often seemingly intractable issues. And it's a clash of culture, it's a clash of ideas, it's a clash of, differences of opinion. And it really goes to our neural and physiological wiring as human beings. And so, we are no different from anywhere else in the world. We just kind of are having our moment of trying to really figure out who we are, what connects us, and what makes us different. And can we still, engage in a democratic, pluralistic society with those differences? And, I think for many, this is a heavy issue. It's hard to engage. I think for people like me and John, who I would imagine, and I'm speaking for him, like to get our hands dirty and kind of the messiness of human relationships and the reality of what it is to be human. So I kind of wake up in this moment and just think this is a hopeful moment because we are really wrestling, I think, with some very deep differences that hopefully can move us forward in a really exciting and I think even more productive way in the future and leave a better kind of foundation for future generations to really do this work. So I would say really the work that I did globally is exactly the same work that I'm doing here. And it's the same work we do in families and communities every day.
Great, thank you. And John, can you tell us a little bit about what spurred you to get into this kind of work?
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here. And Christy, it's really a pleasure to get to hear you speak and learn more about your amazing career. And I look forward to learning more about it as we go. It's a question I get a fair amount. And I think that, for many people who are active in sort of the depolarization space, civic bridge building, a lot of times folks have sort of an aha moment where they realize, hey, this work really matters. It's fundamentally needed to society. And, we've got to place some faith in the idea that we can transcend our differences. I don't really have an aha moment like that for myself, but I sort of grew up at the intersection of race and class in very sort of conspicuous ways. So Helen, you referenced my congressional campaign. That feels like a lifetime ago, to be honest. But I remember, at the age of 26, when I was running for office, the California 43rd is, predominantly sort of left-leaning Black and Latino district, but it does have strong pockets of white and also Asian, more moderate and conservative voters in South Bay LA County. So whether I was speaking to a Black Democratic-leaning church in South Los Angeles or to a sort of say a more white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County, people would ask, what at the age of 26 makes you qualified to represent a district as, diverse and complicated as our own? And I always, I had sort of a canned response that I would give. I would say, well, I have an interesting family background that prepares me for this. My mother's a liberal Black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father. And that's why I could represent all of you, It was usually good for a laugh. But it was also, a reasonable sort of, approximation of my upbringing. I didn't travel very much growing up geographically, but socioeconomically, I sort of went around the world and back on a regular basis. On weekends, I would hang out with my mother's relatives, aunts, grandparents, uncles, cousins, in parts of inner city LA. I'd jump on the bus with my young uncle, and we'd go from neighborhood to neighborhood, and got used to the idea that, we wanted to be careful around the cops, or that there are certain blocks we didn't want to step onto with the wrong color shoelaces, because if we did, we might have a hard time coming out the other side. Over holidays, I'd go and visit my father's family, including my grandparents, who lived in La Jolla, California, in a multi-million-dollar house not far from the water, just a few blocks down the street from Mitt Romney's house, the one with the car elevator that they used to talk about in the 2012 election. And but from day to day, I grew up in multicultural, middle-class Culver City, California, suburban city in Los Angeles, where the motion picture studios are actually concentrated. I was the fourth. I read at some point that Culver City has the fourth most diverse school district in America. My friends growing up were Korean and Indian and Jewish and Black and Latino, and and so many other things. And so, the thing that I think sort of ingrained early on as a mixed kid growing up in a mixed community, but being around very wealthy people and being around people who were from much more modest background, being around, family members who are from the South originally, and then having family members who grew up in, in urban LA. I guess the thing that I realized was that everybody has a story that comes from a deeply sort of human starting point, and that the way that we see the world springs from the way in which we have experienced life, and that even though people oftentimes had difficulty, even including within my own family, maybe especially within my own family, seeing sort of the good and the legitimacy in one another's points of view, I felt like I could always sort of see where folks were coming from, because, ultimately the different perspectives that animated the different members of my family, even if they didn't sort of understand each other, those points of views went into making me. And so for so many Americans who view Republicans and Democrats and Republicans as, the enemy, for me, Democrats and Republicans have always essentially been mom and dad, Black and white, Southern, urban, so on and so forth. So I was always something of an interpreter of people's experiences before I realized that that's what I was doing. And so that kind of naturally grew into the work that I do today, I think.
That's really interesting, because you lived with people having different and I'm going to guess pretty strongly differently held beliefs. I guess I'm wondering, we live in very divisive times, and there can be a hesitancy among some to even consider the viewpoint of those who hold an opposing view. John first, and then Christy, can you tell me, I guess, why it's important that we bridge these differences? Why should we care about hearing from people with whom we disagree with strongly?
Yeah. I'm really glad that you asked that question, because it's important to really nail the why here directly. I could give you an answer and say that, well, it's because, we enrich ourselves when we understand more about the human experience. We make it easier for ourselves as individuals to be able to sort of operate in a complex and diverse society. And it feels good to be able to establish relationships with people who see the world differently than you do. All of that is true and is part of the reason why. But I do think that the reason this is so important in this moment is much more existential than that. I think that the pure and simple fact of democratic society that so many of us, I think, take for granted or have forgotten is the fact that institutions do not work unless the social fabric that undergirds them is intact enough to allow people to work together, to trust the rule of law, the way in which our systems and institutions are meant to operate. Because if we are in the midst of an ongoing tribal war where we do not trust one another interpersonally, we will not trust any of the institutions that we find ourselves operating or find the other side operating. And what that means is that nobody's going to follow the rules any longer than it takes them to use the rules for their own advantage, right? And so you can't trust the integrity of the vote in that kind of circumstance. You can't trust the criminal justice system in that kind of circumstance. You can't trust the media in that sort of situation, because we don't have the sense that the people who disagree with us merely disagree with us, but rather that they are actively trying to harm us. And that is a prerequisite for not to be alarmist, but that is a prerequisite condition for a civil war sort of outcome, right? And so, it's not just about idealism. This is also about hard-nosed realism. If we don't rebuild bridges of understanding between the American people, our ability to function as a society and even to maintain a peaceful sort of order is in jeopardy. And I think that makes this sort of the problem of our time.
And Christy, how about you? What do you tell someone who says, why do I need to hear what someone else says? I don't trust them. I don't believe them. They have fake facts behind them.
I actually don't have a lot to add to what John just said. I mean, he just gave a brilliant answer. I mean, pretty much everything I would have said is encapsulated in kind of his perspective and his response. I'll just add maybe a perspective that I can bring from kind of the global conflict field. There's something that those of us who've worked in the conflict space understand as kind of the conflict ladder. And the steps that a society takes, or even humans individually take, before you really get to kind of all-out violent conflict. And I think it's been both surprising and disheartening as somebody who felt like they were leaving that space to try to help build more, can help knit back together the social fabric here in our country, to see how far and how fast we've moved up that conflict ladder. And so when you hear things like, all out civil war as an option, and a significantly high number of Americans are saying, yes, I either agree with that or I can see it, as being necessary, I think that should alarm all of us. One, because most Americans have never experienced civil war. So the idea that this is being so callously thrown around, I think is the scariest, I think, data point that I've experienced since starting, to do this work here and focusing here in the US. But I think even more so, the simple fact is that America is not America without the diversity that all of us bring to the table, the shared experiences and the different diverse experiences that we all bring. And I'll kind of, take a little bit of a side note, because what's been fascinating in listening to John is how similar our backgrounds are. I had no idea, John, that you were raised in LA. I was as well, in a very mixed, race, interracial family, in an environment where Sunday dinners was, literally served up with politics and religion and culture and societal differences every week. And you had to learn how to come back together the next week as a family across those differences. It is amazing how similar our backgrounds are. And I think the other point that's often missed is, yes, this is about nation building. This is about, social cohesion. This is about conflict avoidance, but it's also about the self and the individual, because we are limited in our own ability to make decisions, to think critically, to be open to learning and growing through the experiences of others. We limit ourselves and our own growth and our own ability to participate in a society that we hopefully are trying to make better for our own children and the future, if we ourselves are limiting ourselves to our own little pockets and communities of agreement. It actually makes us less productive as citizens. It limits our own intellectual ability, and it really limits our ability to move out of our comfort zones and be in relationship with really interesting, cool people. And I think that's what makes America incredibly unique, is because and the melting pot wasn't just because we were all supposed to be the same person. It was because you need all of these different ingredients to make the soup flavorful. You don't want to taste a bland piece, soup. And so I think that's what we miss, is that we need one another. it makes life incredibly richer, and it allows us to intersect and invest and add to a society so that we ourselves enrich it, as opposed to creating a bunch of, kind of very bland, monolithic, communities that all somehow are operating, in isolation from one another.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the tools to kind of bridge those gaps. And Christy, your work and your writing revolves around this idea of empathic intelligence. Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Sure. I always start with something that most people are aware of, which is, empathy really became kind of the hot popular word in large part when Brene Brown started to talk about this idea of vulnerability and courage and the difference between empathy and sympathy. And, I think for kind of popular discourse, she really did kind of bring it to light for a new generation. But I always struggled with the idea of the way in which most Americans define or think about empathy, for several reasons, many of which are kind of wired in our own neural, in the neuroscience of the human condition. So the way in which we're wired to respond to difference. But I think even more so because it was so often grounded in this idea of, walking in somebody else's shoes or looking through their lens and seeing the world through their perspective. And I often said, but if you haven't if your foot hasn't been formed the way somebody else's foot has been formed, you're extremely limited in being able to understand what their shoe feels like. In fact, your foot largely will never fit into their shoe. And you'll always bring your own biases, your own assumptions, your own judgments into how you try to understand somebody else's story or experience. And I came across this work by Dr. Rosalind Arnold. I will not take any credit for this, from the University of Tasmania. She has done an incredible amount of work in this area of empathic intelligence, but mostly around teaching and learning. And when I kind of dove into it, I realized there was such an incredible application in terms of just social, the application to society and culture and how we create societies. And so that's really the deep dive I went on. And what's unique about empathic intelligence and why it is distinct from empathy is that it is not grounded in emotion, because our emotions actually make us often less empathic, because our emotions lead us to empathize with people who are like us. And they lead us away from empathizing with people who are not like us, who are very different from us. And so empathic intelligence actually starts with really an intellectual ability to try to understand where somebody else sits and why it might be different from where you sit. And that can be among lots of continuums. And so that is really how we start. It's a practice, it's a strategic way of living versus an emotional way of living. And not that emotion you remove from it, because as relational beings, we are emotional. And so relational comes, as a part of empathic intelligence, but it is not the totality of it. And so I often think, some of the most empathic people are people who consume stories, who are around diversity, who are constant learners, who are curious about the world around them. Because only until you do that can you have really healthy, strong relationships with people who are different from you, embrace the differences as opposed to seeing them as a threat to your own personhood or to the society or the future you're trying to create. And then ultimately, there's this thing called compassionate empathy. We actually call it sacrificial empathy, because I think as human beings, we've been called to give of ourselves to benefit others or the society in which we exist. And that is impossible unless you have the other two kind of firmly as a part of who you are and how you engage with the world. And so we are really looking at empathic intelligence as not just a kind of relational, emotional way of engaging with difference, but actually a complete kind of countercultural movement that in fact, if you look at some of the most empathic societies, sadly, they're also some of the most homogenous, which is not surprising because they're around people that are like them. And so to take a country like the United States, as diverse as it is, and to kind of, to insert empathic intelligence into it as a cultural norm is incredibly challenging and has to permeate every institution and every aspect of kind of our existence from, from very, from a formative perspective. And so it needs to be in education, it needs to be in government, it needs to be in how communities operate, it needs to be in the faith communities. And so we're trying to do our part to start to seed some of that in institutions and in the institution of the family, especially as we do our work.
That's really interesting. I know we do want to get into a little bit more about kind of ideas and practical tips for how to sort of do that. But I'm wondering if you can just kind of briefly talk a little bit about just, how you take emotion and you weren't saying remove it from the equation, but I guess, suppress it to a certain extent, or at least set it aside so that it's not the driving factor. How do you counsel people to do that when we are at heart emotional beings?
Yeah, it's incredibly challenging. Let me just be honest and upfront. One of the ways that we start is that consuming stories of others is an incredibly powerful tool. And we often do it generally by, you see lots of organizations that say, tell your story. Let's get our stories out there. We actually use something that has really been perfected and popularized by Narrative 4, another organization that's doing conflict work both abroad and here in the US, that starts really with a story exchange. And the reason why the story exchange is so powerful is that when we hear somebody else's story, kind of our neural processing, including our emotions, brings to bear our biases, our judgments, all of our own perspective, right? And it becomes a filter through which we hear somebody else's story. So we're already making judgments and assumptions about who they are based on their story. With the story exchange, this is one way of kind of building your empathic intelligence, is to listen to the story in a way where you are going to have to retell it back to somebody else and tell it back in the first person. And the reason that we do that, we encourage them to do that, is because your brain actually can't tell the difference largely between you telling your own story to somebody and you telling somebody else's story to somebody. And so these are just small nudges and ways to start to break down some of the biases or the preconceived assumptions or, ways in which we think about people who are different from us and that we don't have experience with. And it's a powerful tool because not only do you start to see the person whose story you're telling differently, because you have to get their story right, those filters that we often keep up when we hear somebody else's story actually almost disappear. And so that's kind of, again, these practical ways of kind of removing the emotion, because what we have found is that so much of conflict is actually a physiological neural response to what we perceive as a threat. And what we're trying to help people do is to replace some of those kind of embodied experiences, the way in which your blood boils or you get heated. Those are actually physiological responses to difference. We're trying to give people other ways of thinking about how to respond and to actually feel it so they know how to replace those often what they would consider emotional responses to difference in a way that makes them curious and interested rather than seeing it as a binary fight over right and wrong. And the story exchange process is just one way that we teach people that.
That is really interesting. And I'd like to get into this subject of engaging in difficult conversations some more. John, you do a lot of that with your work with Braver Angels. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of tell people a little bit about what it is that you do and what you've learned from it. For instance, like what are the biggest challenges to having productive conversations, or what are the common characteristics that help promote those productive conversations?
Yeah, indeed. Well, so, I mean, as Christy was getting at, we all come into these conversational spaces, seeing the world through the lens that we inhabit. And our own inevitable subjectivity presents itself as a barrier to our being able to enter into the experiences of other people. And there's a limit to which we can do that, even if we are sort of emotionally empathetic, to Christy's point. I think that there is value in feeling the feelings of others to the extent to which we can. But the skill set that Christy is sort of identifying as being cultivated in the process of sharing stories, being able to sort of articulate somebody else's perspective from your own frame in a first person sort of fashion is something that maps very neatly onto something that we teach in some of our workshops. So first of all, let me say, Braver Angels has a range of different program offerings. I'll give folks a few examples. We have something called a red-blue workshop. And this was our first sort of workshop offering, where we take small groups of people who lean left, call them blues, small groups of people who lean right, say a dozen or half a dozen or so. We say reds in-house. We bring them together not to argue or debate about politics, but to speak from the vantage point of their own life experience or lived experience, if you will. It is quite literally the application of marriage counseling techniques to the relationship between Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. And so that is sort of a relational building exercise that's sort of, rooted in the sharing of experiences. And so part of where that starts is each side has the opportunity to list out stereotypes that they see the other side as having about them. They each do that in their own groups and separate rooms. They come back together to share those stereotypes, but then each side reflects on whether or not there's a kernel of truth in the stereotypes that they've listed. And so, Republicans will oftentimes say something like, well, people think that we're racist. That's not true, but they might also reflect and say, but that doesn't mean there aren't, a number of racists who identify with the conservative movement, and we shouldn't accept that. And oftentimes you'll have blues who will say things like, well, people say that the other side says we hate America. That's not true. But, on the other hand, maybe some of us could do a better job at seeing the good things in the country, even while we're trying to point out the things that need to change, things like that. So we have this red-blue workshop. We have something called Depolarizing Within, which is aimed at sort of modifying the internal dialogue that we walk around with, so that we are not thinking in stereotypical terms about other people, but that we have a more fleshed out, nuanced understanding of why other people think the way that they do, that actually appears in our internal conversation, because we all have an internal dialogue that's sort of running 24/7. And when that's on autopilot, that can lead us into reactionary sort of behavior when we find ourselves in a certain social situation. But to tie it to what Christy was saying, we also have something called a Skills for Bridging the Divide workshop, where we focus in on the art of interpersonal communication, sort of more effective, empathetic interpersonal communication. And we have a formula to sort of simplify it that's we call the LAPP formula, LAPP. And so that stands for listen, acknowledge, pivot, and perspective. And so it starts with listening to actually hear as opposed to listening to respond, right? And the acknowledgement portion really rests on the art of paraphrasing. And so if you have somebody, let's say that, I'm a pro-life individual speaking to a pro-choice individual. Let's say I'm listening to this person offer her perspective on why she is pro-choice. A reactionary sort of, response to that point of view, or a characterization of that point of view from somebody who's very polarized, coming from the pro-life side of the conversation, might go something along the lines of, oh, you don't care about, unborn babies or something like that, But if I am listening to hear and then acknowledging the person's perspective, I need to be able to paraphrase their perspective in a way that shows that I can represent their beliefs in terms that they themselves would recognize as actually equating to the way they actually see the world, see the issue. So rather than, somebody from a pro-life perspective saying, oh, you don't care about unborn babies, if such an individual were instead to say, what you're saying isn't that that you don't care about children or what have you, but that you have a definite belief about the sovereignty that a woman is entitled to with respect to choosing what to do with her own body, and B, you have perhaps a different opinion than I do with respect to when human consciousness forms in a way that allows it to enjoy the benefit of legal rights. That, depending on who you're talking to, is likely to be a much more authentic representation of how that person's internal dialogue actually operates, right? And so what we do is we tend to substitute the characterizations of other people's internal dialogues for our own stereotypical dialogue, right? And that becomes a major sort of obstacle to effective communication. But if you challenge yourself to be able to represent the other person's view in terms that they themselves would use to describe it, you show to that person that you are genuinely listening, that you genuinely respect the substance of what they have to say and the truth about what they believe. So you listen, you acknowledge their point of view through an effective paraphrasing of what it is they have just told you. You pivot in a way that introduces your own subjectivity in a humble sort of framing. And so we lean a lot on I statements at Braver Angels. A pro-life person might say, I have a different point of view, or I actually have a somewhat different experience with this issue. And it leads me to see the world leads me to see it a little bit differently. And it's just a quick move, but by saying I have a certain view on this, as opposed to saying, well, but the fact is this, or using what we call a truth statement, saying like, oh, well, you just don't understand the issue. Here's what the truth is. You introduce your own perspective in a way that demonstrates humility. And that undermines any sense that you are trying to be a threat towards that other person, psychologically or emotionally. I may disagree, but if I introduce my disagreement by saying, well, I have a different experience here, I'm inviting you into my human story, as opposed to trying to put you on the defensive by weaponizing facts or what I think are facts in an argument against you. And then the last part is the easiest part. You just share your perspective. You share your story. This is why I'm pro-life. But it comes after these other steps: listening, acknowledging, and paraphrasing the person's point of view back to them in a way that shows them that they're genuinely heard, introducing the fact that you're going to share your story through that I statement, telegraphing humility, and then offering your perspective. Now we're in a place where the conversation is flowing. Now we're in a place where we're genuinely listening and hearing each other. And this provides the opportunity for us to bring down the hostility and to bring up our capacity for learning from each other. And, the fact is that the vast majority of us, particularly in political conversations, are not schooled in this way of interacting. We get our lessons from cable news and talk radio, and, the way we hear politicians speaking. That's what's normalized. And so to Christy's point about needing to sort of re-norm conversational practices across institutions and parts of American society, 100% yes. And that's what Braver Angels seeks to build an infrastructure for, an infrastructure that takes these practices that are demonstrated in our workshops and seeds them in government, college campuses, corporations, local communities, and even kitchen tables. And so, that's the obstacle that we're presented with, the norms that come through retail political discourse. These are the solutions that we bring to bear.
And so, John, is it enough to just share perspectives and listen to perspectives, or how do you bridge the divide beyond that? I imagine that becomes sort of the common understanding, I guess, and then where do things go from there?
Well, I think that conversation is not enough unto itself. I think that conversation is a necessary starting point, and the sharing of stories is a necessary starting point. At a certain point, we have to actually start doing work together, and, there's something that I've noticed in, my life and career, having done some political organizing and community work, in local places where you can have two individuals who agree about 90% of a given subject or set of issues. And then they will tear each other apart on the basis of the 10% of things they disagree on, if all they're doing is talking, and if they're talking in the way that, we're kind of societally conditioned to sort of engage in our disagreements. On the other hand, I've seen people who probably disagree about 90% when it comes to politics, who agree about 10% of a thing, but if that 10% lies in the area of a common goal, a common area of work, for instance, how can we provide better education to inner city kids or to at-risk youth? I've seen liberals and conservatives who probably agree on little else engage deeply and actually work together, on this seemingly narrow area of agreement, because it's a place where they can actually build together, because both sides, care about children. And I have specific experiences because, I've worked a bit in education with, both liberal leaning and conservative leaning educators, tutors, and people who are trying to provide resources directly to at-risk communities, where that common ground has been found, right? Because we are working together, because there's tangible benefit to be harvested from our laboring together towards some greater good. And in that shared work, we actually have a more, I would say, accurate window into one another's characters than we necessarily have just by knowing how somebody voted, or just by sort of, listening to them talk about their politics or their political ideology. So conversation, story sharing is a must, but in Braver Angels work, we're also creating communities of collaboration. We have 80 bipartisan alliances located in physical communities, and 80 physical communities across America. We have campus-based activities where Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and others come together to put on programs, to engage in projects together. And we look to do a heck of a lot more of that. So actually sharing the work together after we've gotten to know each other in a more deeply sort of understanding way, that becomes the path forward. And so, that's where conversation ought and I think must lead.
Kelly, can I add something to what John just said? Because John said something so incredibly important, and I don't want people to miss it. When he talked about the 10% that people who, agree on, even if 90% they don't agree, that if they can work together in that 10%, real change and real outcomes can happen. And it is a that is a bridging, outcome. It is, you need that action together over shared values, shared beliefs, shared goals. And I think when you look at our society right now, especially our governance, the way in which our government works, we actually once had a government where parties could work together on the 10%. We have suddenly come to a point in our culture, our society, and the way in which we want or desire government to function, or at least we think we want government to function, where all of a sudden we don't want them working at all on any percent. They have to we have come to a point in our culture where we see the world through binary choices of my way or their way, win or lose. There is no common ground. There is no shared goals. And so when I see the public angry at elected officials because they dared to cross the aisle and work together towards a common goal that they believe will benefit the majority of our country, when that becomes the pariah, then I don't think we even recognize how much we lose, because we are now moving into a future where government is only ruled by the majority. The minority has no say. And so you have a pendulum swing. It's a battle for who has that extra 1%. And I think that, to me, is the greatest threat to our country being able to solve the really big issues that not just need to be solved at a national level, but at a deeply local level. So I didn't want anyone to miss the value of what John just raised, and the work that Braver Angels is doing to try to renormalize the way in which our culture right now is operating.
No, thank you for highlighting that. And that actually brings up the next question, which is, how do we start to change that? What does the average community member do to, I guess, first of all, encounter different perspectives and welcome them, but what do they do to try to change that dynamic?
We really start with the idea that you cannot be an empathically intelligent person. You can't actually be a functioning individual in a pluralistic society, a diverse society, if you're not deeply curious about the lived experience of somebody outside of your own. And so I think that has to be part of the way in which we start to teach and talk within all of our institutions, whether that's the family to government to education, is how do we start to embrace the differences? And I think it's also important to recognize, and I always have to say this caveat, especially for people who are either deeply religious or who have very deep ideas or beliefs in a certain area, that empathy or being empathic doesn't mean agreement, and it doesn't mean approval. I can actually be empathic about somebody who has harmed me. It's not that I approve or necessarily even accept their position or their actions, but learning to unpack and understand and ask the questions of why they might have done that, what might have motivated them to be in this situation, what might be behind, what's the story behind why they believe what they do, or they decide and make decisions the way they do, is incredible. I mean, when you talk about becoming a critical thinker, that's what a critical thinker is. It's somebody who asks those questions. And so practically, we always start with encouraging people to just start there, to start asking the question, even to yourself, why might they have said that? Why might they hold that position? What might be in their story different than mine, or their background or experiences different than mine, that might lead them to that outcome? Because when you start to unpack that and ask those questions, one, it becomes a part of the way you live. So, for me, having grown up with lots of books, I read books my entire, young life, and still do to this day. I realize when somebody comes and says, hey, I believe X, I'm deeply interested in the why, because I love stories. I love to understand somebody else's experience. And that helps me do that. So that's goes back to that early question of how do you remove the emotion out of it? Because I'm not doing it to necessarily agree or approve or accept their position. It's because I become a better listener, a better communicator, and I become actually I'm a more intelligent person when I ask consistently those questions. And it also kind of makes me it allows me to become more of an expert in human behavior, which means that I know how to navigate these differences because I actually am growing myself in that knowledge. So it's just such an easy way. And I always say that to the people who are kind of in our workshops or that we're doing work with, the question why is the easiest question we have in the human language and one of the least used questions that we use. And so if you just start there with asking yourself why, you will be surprised at 6 months from now, a year from now, how it just becomes automatic in whenever you're engaging with human beings or concepts that you don't understand.
And John, how about you? Is there anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one way of summarizing what Christy just said is just that, we want to make curiosity a value, a foundational sort of value for a diverse society like our own. We need it. And in that vein, I'll give a quick plug to my colleague at Braver Angels, our senior fellow for public practice, someone who folks in this audience may know. She's a Seattle journalist named Monica Guzman, who's written an incredible book called I Never Thought About It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. And so the subject of curiosity is one that is very much fit for the moment, necessary for the moment. I also want to say that, I take a lot of my philosophical inspiration from the philosophy of nonviolence, and particularly as it was practiced and promoted by Martin Luther King Jr. And many people, are familiar with King's work without being deeply familiar with his philosophy and the fact that he was a systematic philosopher in his own right. And what philosophical nonviolence rests upon is this idea that love is a spiritual power that can be used for social change. And by love, what King meant, agape love, was essentially sort of the virtue and value and practice of goodwill. This idea that by carrying an essential goodwill within myself for the person with whom I disagree, right, for all humanity, but including the people whom I disagree with and people who may even be causing me harm. Although, this is a big thing to ask of somebody, right? But that by maintaining that internal goodwill towards the other party, I am able to more effectively speak to their conscience and to the better angels of their nature, so that I am morally empowering myself to be more persuasive in the context of my social and political and ethical views. And that even if I fail to change somebody's mind in the space of a single conversation, because that's not usually going to happen, what you generally are able to do, though, is to be able to give them a clear window in terms of your own human quality, right? In a way that makes it harder for them to hold on to the malicious stereotype, the image that they may have of you. But you also liberate yourself from the albatross of judgment, from the albatross of hatred, from fear even. Because when you are able to see somebody from an essential kind of prism of love and goodwill, you sort of recognize what Dr. King recognized, which is the fact that people who are consumed in hatred and ignorance are essentially people who are sick. They have a disease, and it's something that we all may find ourselves susceptible to or vulnerable to at one point in time or another across much of our lives, because that's just sort of germane to the human condition, right? So it doesn't profit us a lot to judge each other, even while it's very understandable, but it's very liberating to love each other in terms of this kind of higher level of goodwill towards humanity. If you can carry that inside of yourself, it will empower you in everything that you do. And certainly it'll make it easier for you to survive and thrive in American politics.
Great, thank you. I do want to ask a few of these audience questions. And the first one is, can this work be scaled? Can we expand these conversations broadly enough to have real impact? If either of you want to take that, that'd be great.
Well, I have an answer to that question. I think that the short answer is yes, this work can be scaled. I think that the part of it that can scale most quickly is the narrative and storytelling part of it. And so there is a need to build up sort of media projects and media infrastructure, storytelling infrastructures that can demonstrate at scale the norms that we ultimately seek to cultivate across institutions and sectors of society. If people can see it done, if they can see that, hey, it's not actually crazy to think that I can humanize somebody on the other side of these divides and live my life in this way, then it becomes easier for people to sort of take that example. The difficulty is just that the industrial incentives are all aligned in the direction of polarization and demonization for the most part. But that's why that scales so effectively. It's a big part of why it scales so effectively, is because you've got these outlets that have that as a business model. So if we could essentially take something like that formula and create a narrative culture that reaches enough people, we then would be able to point people in the directions of the actual organizing activities and the actual sort of ways of kind of improving ourselves, the resources that are actually available to sort of deepen our command of empathic intelligence, to borrow Christy's phrase. So, but it can be done.
I'll add to that. I 100% agree, but kind of there are also two practical ways. Well, one practical and one that's completely dependent on the human will and desire. Right now, there is a multi-billion-dollar industry, as John alluded to, in supporting polarization.
Yeah.
And there is a fraction, and I mean a tiny fraction, of capital that is supporting the healing or depolarization. And so it's a numbers game right now. I mean, to be really honest. And, for those of us that are in this space, we know that we're kind of, clawing at the edges, trying to, build the capacity to actually, kind of challenge like I said, the multi-billion-dollar industry that is really creating the field that we are working in. So I think that's an incredibly important point, is that there has to be an equal force to push back against the fast scaling polarization that we've seen over the past several decades.
Couldn't agree more.
The other thing is, we asked ourselves this question early on in IDEOS's history. We actually did a small group dialogue after January 6th with a very diverse group of kind of high-level leaders who were struggling and needed kind of a private space to figure out whether or not, the future of America was possible. And, and we had people who were, stepping down from the Trump administration, others who had worked in the Obama administration, some CEOs. And when I told people about the outcome, they said, we do not believe this is possible. And I mean, verbatim, like, either you're lying or people were literally like, putting you on, because, by the end, nobody wants to be the bad guy that still hates the other side. And so we produced a film, and it really was that when people ask, why did you produce Dialogue Lab America? I say, because I wanted people to know it's possible. And film is an incredible, I mean, both John and I, LA based, what better than to, pull on the, our Hollywood, assets here. But really it was because film, one, is a powerful medium for scaling ideas. It's also a very safe way of allowing people to engage with an idea that they may not be ready. For someone who's ready for a Braver Angel, I mean, we stand on the shoulders of the work that Braver Angels has done, but there are an incredibly, and I'm sure they would admit, a lot of people who are just either afraid, disincentivized based on the communities and the spaces where they live to actually engage in something like a Braver Angels or any other, or even our own workshops. A film is a very safe space to do that. Inviting people over to say, hey, watch this, is really powerful. And it's also the reason why when we basically cast the film, the documentary, we wanted to make sure, and we used the Hidden Tribes report, kind of the 11, political identities of Americans. We used that as kind of the barometer for how we cast, because we wanted no one to show up and see the film and feel like their voice or perspective wasn't at least in part represented in the film. Because I think it's incredibly important for people to recognize that this is not a you're right or you're wrong. It's not a call out moment. It's a call in moment to say, we all need each other. And your voice and your perspective and your history and your story matters when it comes to the future of our country. And it's okay to have a clash of ideas. It's okay to have a clash of values. But as long as we can continue to humanize one another on the other side of that continuum, the other side of that difference, recognizing that ultimately we're all trying to move forward towards a better tomorrow, maybe in parallel on different lanes, and at different speeds, but that ultimately few want the destruction of our nation, or their own community. And so it's just really kind of allowing them to see that something is possible, so that it motivates them to go join a Braver Angels, right? To show up and do the hard work that sometimes can be really challenging.
So we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm actually going to, and I have two questions I want to ask. Just real briefly, can each of you tell us how people can get involved in your programs, or how they can participate in your programs?
I'll let John go first because his is easy.
Sure, absolutely. Yes. Well, you can go to the website, braverangels.org. You can join us if you are interested, and I encourage folks to as a member. Dues are as little as $1 a month. We have over 11,000 dues paid members across America. And there are opportunities to volunteer, to put on workshops, to participate in them, to engage with our media content. Of course, we do place-based activities, but we do a lot over Zoom since the pandemic. That's how we've reached a majority of people. And that's been incredibly effective. So come to the website, sign up as a member. And even if you're just curious, subscribe to the newsletter and you'll find opportunities to participate, whether you're a member or not. And so, yeah, just check out the, just knock on the front door. We'll let you in.
I have three quick ways. One, our film Dialogue Lab America is up free. We had incredible donors who said we wanted this to be free. It's on YouTube. So, watch it, share it. That's a great way to engage and kind of learn in the safety of your own home or on your phone. So that's one. Two, kind of similar, with Braver Angels, we do trainings. We actually kind of do more of a leadership. So we bring in, facilitators, coaches, leaders of organizations, and actually train them in this work. And so you can find that on our website, which is idiosinstitute.org. And then finally, we're also the founding organization and have the lead partner for the National Day of Dialogue, which is annually on January 5th. And so we're actually in early stages of preparing for that, which is an opportunity for people to engage with different perspectives, kind of hear and learn on, perspectives on some of our greatest, big challenges and topics that we're talking about, like gun control, climate change, now, the future of abortion rights, all of that, and then get to practice the practice of dialogue on these really hard issues. And so, you can go to actually nationaldayofdialogue.com to learn more information or to sign up.
Great. And finally, before I hand this back over to Colby, if each of you can tell us what in your work is making you hopeful right now.
I'll just go and say, we work a lot with younger generations, so college students and kind of early career leaders who, are looking to influence their institutions, their communities, young community leaders. And I think there's a unique difference between older generations and younger generations. And that is the with the entrance of social media and the expansion of the internet, they are engaging with people from all over the world who have very different experiences, stories. And the fact that so many of them are embracing those stories, those histories, leveraging them, learning about them, creating content about them, to me, that is incredibly hopeful. So that's really what gives me hope.
Yeah, I could say something similar about seeing, Gen Z beginning to sort of step up and lead the way in some of this work. And there's an organization called Bridge USA that we work with on college campuses, which is an extraordinary example of that. I encourage folks to look into it. But beyond that, I think I would say that energy, attention, resources. I mean, Christy is right. It's still a fraction of what we need in comparison to sort of the multi-billion-dollar polarization complex. But philanthropy, I think, is starting to rally behind this work more and more. Elected officials, former elected officials, people with followings, name recognition, businesses, and just ordinary Americans from across the country are starting to look up and realize, like, hey, wait a second, this cannot sustain itself. We have to find a way to respond and heal constructively, right? And so, folks are coming to us. And there's a great energy that's sort of coming into this space that I think is, making it more than a space. It really is a movement that is rising, and it's humble, but that doesn't mean it won't change the country.
Great. Thank you, both of you, for a fantastic and encouraging conversation. We are about out of time, so I'm going to hand this back to you, Colby.
Thank you so much, Helen. We could continue on this topic for hours, but sadly, we're actually a couple of minutes over for today. So briefly, on behalf of the Murdoch Trust, we want to thank all three of you for joining us today, for your time, your thoughtful discussion, and also for all of our participants who were able to join and listen to this conversation as well. Your commitment to serving the common good is so important to seeing our communities and our region flourish and thrive. We hope to see all of you next week on our session on lifting the fog on climate change, and we hope that you have a fabulous rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You.